I've written a few things, so if I'm glancing down now and then, I'm looking at things that I've written, because this is a very different offering than the one I planned several months ago in response to the invitation by our host, the wonderful Buddhist Sangha in Little Rock. And the difference isn't just that this platform, this online meeting. We all find ourselves suddenly and shockingly in a different world. Within just the last week, we're all sort of staggering anxiously into a disturbingly altered context, medically and socially, economically, politically. And it's difficult to find stable ground as everything changes with such frightening speed and in ways that leave us fumbling for certainty where there is none. So why now, in this new reality, commanding our attention and our best efforts to survive, would we even take the time to spend reflecting on this slim volume of talks offered in someone's living room by an obscure Japanese priest 50 years ago? Because tucked inside these deceptively simple and gentle teachings are powerful guides for how we can actually make our way through all of this. Our lives are being transformed in ways most of us never imagined. But I believe this is what Shunryu Suzuki actually had in mind. Nothing less than the transformation of our hearts, our minds, and our character. The teachings don't tell us how to combat a virus or how to inspire cooperation in a divided world, but he was just bringing what he had to offer. The Dharma, his own ancient practice from Japan, to people hungry for a new way of life. You have to remember these teachings were given in Northern California in the 60s. And he was doing his best to offer something in a foreign country, sharing his deepest understandings of Buddhism in a language he could barely speak. And like us, everything was on the line. Nothing was easy, but everything mattered. We're all coming to realize that we can no longer really hold the kinds of assumptions, mostly out of our awareness, that we will have plenty of time to practice. And this practice will benefit us in some way over time. And they will have the health and energy to do so in a beautiful and safe practice center somewhere with our friends. All of this has changed. We certainly hope to create warm and connected sanghas and probably do some good, but there's also a sense of false entitlement embedded in these assumptions. And unfortunately, we're coming to understand this in a very real, immediate, and frightening way. We've kind of been jerked into attention by the uncertainty and vulnerability, and it's sometimes even the despair. But this is precisely what the Buddha's teachings address. There's no better time to practice than now. And beginner's mind, in the way that Suzuki taught it, is the right teaching for this time. I want to make sure you understand, this is not simplified Buddhism when we say beginners. This isn't Zen light. So please don't confuse beginner's mind with a beginner's practice. This is the whole practice, the full path, the foundation of ongoing awakening. And beginner's mind is not going back to basics, this kind of regression into something naive or innocent. It's a perspective and a practice path which can help us in these times. And that help does not come in the form of restoring the fantasies of some hopeful future that we all think that we were promised. Most of us by now probably feel some sense of being robbed of the bright future that we felt was owed to us. And this is particularly an American illusion, I think, in some ways, or at least a modern Western view, that the future is always bright and things will always, eventually and inevitably get better. 2,500 years ago, the Prince Siddhartha Gautama plunged into a practice that changed the world in precisely the same way. He had it all: a great, abundant, rich, protected life. But when he discovered that his illusory and limited views of the world weren't actually real, that people suffered the decline of old age, that they did become ill and eventually died, he was stopped in his tracks, as we are now, by this knowledge. It's not new knowledge, but it's a new impact. And he knew he had to turn in a new direction if he was to meet the whole of life more wisely and compassionately. And now, so must we. So let's dedicate our practice in this brief time together this evening to all those who are ill, to all those who are caring for the ill, for all those who are working for the benefit of those in need in any way, and for all who are practicing for the sake of others. In other words, for all beings everywhere. So we take just a moment to have a sense of offering the merit of our practice to all beings everywhere. Now, obviously, in this brief amount of time, I'm not going to teach the full content of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind in this short talk, but I do hope that you will read the book. I hope that you will get it and take a look. Mine, the one I was just showing you, this one's about to fall apart because I've read it and reread it so many times over the years. So my hope is that in this time together, I can orient you to this small text and also the practice perspective, which will inform and support any Buddhist practice, regardless of the lineage or cultural form. Whether you practice in a Vipassana tradition, a Tibetan tradition, Chinese Chan or Japanese Zen, it doesn't really matter. If you're a Christian or a Jew, it doesn't matter. Islamic, all of these practices are going to be supported and deepened by the teachings that we're going to review tonight. Someone asked Suzuki Roshi once, what is Zen? And he said, Zen is when any religion goes beyond itself, including Zen. So he's making a little bit of a cheeky statement that this practice is for everyone. And so I hope that when we finish this particular talk, that you'll leave wanting more, maybe with more curiosity and more willing to step back into the spacious possibility of beginner's mind. You know, Suzuki Roshi in the late 60s was teaching beginners. These are people that had no experience of Zen, very little experience with Buddhism. They thought he was some sort of fantastic Zen master. They had ideas and projections, and they said, can we study with you? And he said, well, you know, I sit at 5:30 in the morning. You can come if you'd like. And this little book is made from early talks given in a local sitting group in Los Altos, California, in someone's living room in the beginning, not in a monastery, not in a temple. And they were his attempts to help people, just like us, with everyday lives, with their problems and to support their aspirations to live a more wholesome life. The idea of recording these talks came to a woman, Marian Derby, who organized the Los Altos group. People gathered at her home in the beginning, and she recorded and transcribed these talks each week, which became the first draft of the book. Marian lived until 2013, when she died at age 90. The transcripts that Marian produced and she gave to Trudy Dixon, who had done some editing of the publications at the very young Zen Center at that time, and she edited the talks for publication. She came up with 3 sections, and the titles of each talk mostly came from the body of the talk itself. When she finished the editing, which is a prodigious amount of work, given that Suzuki Roshi was speaking in a second language and she was attempting to make the talks flow, she died of cancer just at age 30, just as she turned in the manuscript. Her husband, Mike, who was a painter, did a painting for the book, which some of you are quite familiar with because it's beautiful. He did the fly. It's actually a painting that he did. Suzuki Roshi loved the idea of a frog because a frog would sit still, breathing. But if a fly came by, it was responsive. Then we'd go back to sitting. So it was he loved the image. And so the fly made its way into the book. Richard Baker, the abbot at the Zen Center at that time, saw that the book found a publisher. And over the years, it has become an enduring classic. It's actually a bestseller. It's one of the best-selling Buddhist books of all times. And it's gone outside the boundaries of Buddhist literature even and found its way to others. The only talk in the book, by the way, that is not wasn't given to this small group in Los Altos is the epilogue at the end, which is it's a condensation of 2 talks, which was later given at San Francisco Zen Center's Page Street Temple, the place where I did most of my training and most of my formal practice. 40 years after its publication, which is now 10 years ago, David Chadwick, his biographer who wrote Crooked Cucumber, wrote an afterword, which doesn't appear in this volume. If you buy the 40th anniversary edition, there's an afterwards. This is what he said. When Shunryu Suzuki saw a published copy of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, he looked it over for a minute and commented, "Good book. I didn't write it, but it looks like a good book." That was 40 years ago, in the summer of 1970. He and a few students were in the foyer of the San Francisco Zen Center's City Center, standing around some boxes of the newly published hardcover. Most of Suzuki's students didn't get too excited when Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind came out. We had him. And he told us to forget what he said in his lectures, and instead to put our effort wholeheartedly into zazen and mindfulness. The most enthusiastic responses came from outside of the community and outside of his students. But Shunryu Suzuki's renown as a seminal spiritual teacher is almost entirely due to this one unique volume. Rick Fields, another Buddhist teacher who's also died, wrote what some of you may have seen, How the Swans Came to the Lake. It's a history of Western Buddhism. This is what he wrote. Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind had a fresh, early morning quality to it. Suzuki Roshi spoke with a spare voice, unpretentious and humorous. It was in fact an American Buddhist voice, unlike any heard before, and yet utterly familiar. when Suzuki Roshi spoke, it was as if American Buddhists could hear themselves perhaps for the first time. And I've had that experience. In 1994, as I began my formal practice at San Francisco Zen Center, a friend of mine knew I was traveling to practice there when I could. And he said, could I sit with you? I'd like to learn to meditate. And I said, well, I don't know what I'm doing, but sure, come sit with me. And so we met every Thursday morning in my office, in the group room, my psychotherapy office. And we put some cushions on the floor and lit a candle and some incense. And we had a cassette tape player. Remember cassette tape players? And we listened each week to one chapter of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, read by Peter Coyote, who did the audio book. When we got to the end, we started over. That sitting with two people became three people with my yoga teacher, Devin Diedrich, and then later other friends came. And that was the seed that created the Austin Zen Center. In 1997, I saw that there was a practice period happening in Japan, a 1-month intensive practice led by my teacher, Blanche Hartman, her teacher, Mel Weitzman, and Suzuki Roshi's son, Uitsu Suzuki, at Suzuki Roshi's temple, Rinsoen, in Yaizu, Japan. And I thought, well, I can't really miss this. It's a chance to experience traditional practice with my teacher, the person she received Dharma transmission from, Suzuki Roshi's son, in his temple. It was a complete connection. During that time, we went to visit Eiheiji, Dogen Zenji's temple, which he established in the early 13th century. It's the lineage in which Suzuki Roshi trained, and it's the lineage in which I'm ordained. So this was home. And Blanche was going at that time to do a ceremony to confirm her Dharma transmission in Japan. As we say, ceremony. She became abbot for one day ceremonially at Eiheiji. There were about 18 of us, and the first day we were there, we went into the zendo to sit in our full robes. Classically, we were sitting on the tan, which is an elevated platform, facing the wall. And sitting in silence, we could hear the door open to the zendo, and someone walked in. And of course, you don't move, you don't turn around. And out of the corner of my eye, I could see a person walk to the end of the tan and look at us in line. It was Nakashima Roshi, head of international relations for Eiheiji, and he had been a very young man when Suzuki Roshi was at Eiheiji. He had known him. And so as this long line of Americans is sitting there, Nakashima could speak English. He said, when Suzuki Roshi left in 1959 to come to America, when I heard him teaching San Francisco, I didn't understand him. I could not understand what he was doing. Today, I see what he was doing. And then he turned and walked out. I can feel the tears rising now, like they did then. It was a very, very sweet moment. And this is what Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind set in motion. Richard Baker, in his introduction, said, the practice of Zen mind is beginner's mind. The innocence of the first inquiry, what am I, is needed throughout Zen practice. The mind of the beginner is empty, free of the habits of the expert, ready to accept and to doubt, and open to all the possibilities. It's the kind of mind which can see things as they are, which step by step, and in a flash, can realize the original nature of everything. So let's walk through a few highlights, beginning with the prologue, in which we find the famous statement about beginner's mind. And by the way, if you read the book or you borrow the book from someone, read the prologue. It's enough for a lifetime. It's actually hard to get past just the prologue. And I'm going to select just a few things from it. If you have your book there, you can take a look at it. But certainly it's not necessary. But I'm going to give you just a feel for some of the teachings as we just take a few stepping stones through the book. Suzuki Roshi begins, people say practicing Zen is difficult, but there is a misunderstanding as to why. It's not difficult because it is hard to sit in the cross-legged position or to attain enlightenment. It's difficult because it's hard to keep our mind pure and our practice pure in its fundamental sense. I'm interested in helping you keep your practice from becoming impure. In Japan, we have the phrase shoshin, S-H-O-S-H-I-N, shoshin, which means beginner's mind. The goal of practice is always to keep our beginner's mind. Later in that paragraph, he says, our original mind includes everything within itself. It's always rich and sufficient within itself. You should not lose your self-sufficient state of mind. This does not mean a closed mind, but actually an empty mind and a ready mind. If your mind is empty, it's always ready for anything. It's open to everything. And then the famous statement comes. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. And I believe, as a comment, he's speaking about basic awareness. The Dzogchen practitioners in Tibet talk about this pristine state very similarly in every tradition. So it doesn't mean an empty mind like a blank consciousness. It means primary consciousness that holds everything, out of which everything arises and which everything passes away, to return to that rather than the complex contents of our consciousness with which we become so enchanted and lose our way. Later on, he says, in the beginner's mind, there's no thought, I have attained something. All self-centered thoughts limit our vast mind. See, that's one of the contents we get enchanted by. I got something. When we have no thought of achievement, no thought of self, we're true beginners. Then we can really learn something. The beginner's mind is the mind of compassion. And when our mind is compassionate, it is boundless. And that one sentence when he says, when our mind is compassionate and is boundless, he's including all of wisdom and all of compassion, the foundations of Buddhist teachings. Dogen Zenji, the founder of our school, always emphasized how important it is to resume our boundless original mind. Then we're always true to ourselves, in sympathy with all beings, and can actually practice. So the most difficult thing is always to keep your beginner's mind. There's no need to have a deep understanding of Zen. Even though you read much Zen literature, you must read each sentence with a fresh mind. You should not say, I know what Zen is, or I've attained enlightenment. This is also the real secret of the arts. Always be a beginner. And I've seen images of him when he's talking, he would say, be very careful about this point. If you start to practice Zazen, You will begin to appreciate your beginner's mind. It's the secret of Zen practice. So you can see in sort of the simple, encouraging, sort of gently parental language in a way. He's calling us forward. And these are deep and complete teachings in a language that seems quite simple. But because it's so layered, you can read it again and again and again. So how do you keep beginner's mind? How is this practice actualized? The first section of the book, there are 3 sections, is titled Right Practice. And the first 3 chapters are on posture, breathing, and control. 3 things that I bet everyone who's listening right now has thought about at some time in their practice. How do I sit? What do I do about the breathing? How do I control my crazy mind? Here's just a few pieces. Posture. He said, enlightenment is not some good feeling or some particular state of mind. The state of mind that exists when you sit in the right posture is itself enlightenment. If you cannot be satisfied with the state of mind you have in Zazen, it means your mind is still wandering about. Our body and mind should not be wandering about in this posture. There's no need to talk about the right state of mind. You already have it. This is the conclusion of Buddhism. Just that small bit is a little difficult for people to understand sometimes, because he's teaching in his way what Dogen taught in his revolutionary way, that there's not practice to gain enlightenment, that practice was an expression of enlightenment. If the awakened mind is your basic nature, if it's what's most natural and true, and if it's the understanding of the unconditioned reality of the universe, how could you create that? You can't create the uncreated. You can't make the unconditioned, but you can realize it, and then you can express it. You can celebrate it. And in Zazen, in the upright posture of Zazen, is the small ceremony that we do to celebrate and to pay homage to our original nature, our true state of mind. So when he says enlightenment is not some good feeling or some particular state of mind, he's pulling the rug out from what most of us begin with. I do want to feel better, and I want to have this amazing state of mind called enlightenment, which usually means sort of like getting high, but for most of us. But when you let that go and realize, oh, fundamentally, my life is an expression of this great mystery, that I can sit down and sit upright and be silent, and in that small ceremony, acknowledge the truth of my own nature and yours and everyone else's. In the second little talk on breathing, he said, we say inner world and outer world, but actually there's just one whole world. In this limitless world, our throat is like a swinging door. If you say, I breathe, the I is extra. What we call I is just a swinging door, which moves when we inhale, when we exhale. It just moves. That is all. When your mind is pure and calm enough to follow this movement, there's nothing. No I, no world, no body or mind, just a swinging door. It's a beautiful image, I think, And it once again pulls just a slight rug out from under the idea that there's a special way I should breathe, and if I do, then I'll achieve this special thing. If everything drops away and there's simply the movement of breath, it's happening on its own. You don't have to try to do it. You certainly aren't required to manipulate it. I was reading a story once when he was speaking to a student, and they were asking what Zazen was. He says, you know, that moment when you exhale and there's a tiny pause before you inhale? He said, you know, you don't have to worry about it. You'll inhale. And if you don't, well, that's the end. That's just fine. So posture expresses our true nature, our enlightened quality of the natural state. Our breath is just a swinging door. As we drop away, the I makes an object out of the breath with a subject. We just watch the movement. But then, of course, there's the mind. Chapter 3, control. He said, the reason everything looks so beautiful is because it is out of balance. So we could stop right there. We could do a whole Dharma talk on that first phrase. The reason everything looks so beautiful is because it's out of balance, but its background is always in perfect harmony. And that simple sentence, he gives us all the teachings, the absolute teachings of the Prajnaparamita. He goes on, this is how everything exists in the realm of Buddha nature, losing its balance against a background of perfect balance. So if you see things without realizing the background of Buddha nature, everything appears to be in the form of suffering. But if you understand the background of existence, you realize that suffering itself is how we live and how we extend our life. So in Zen, sometimes we do emphasize the imbalance or disorder of life. The reason everything looks beautiful is because it's out of balance. The impulse for compassion, for care, for the poignant beauty of what it's like to be human comes forward because we see the difficulties, the struggles, the frailties, the vulnerabilities, everything around us. But its background is always perfect harmony. Everything is actually okay. That's hard to realize when you listen to the news, isn't it? Everything is working in harmony with everything else, always. It may not be what I want. It might not be what you want. It might not be what we prefer, but everything is working in harmony. From on the top of this hill in Molokai, we can see the weather. We see what happens in the ocean and the sky or the land. Everything is in harmony. We might not want it to rain. We might not want the wind to blow. Might not want it to be hot, but we're seeing how everything is in response to everything else. We don't want to be infected by a virus. The virus is just being a virus. We're being ourselves. Everything is in perfect harmony. Everything is responding to everything else. That's the background of perfect harmony. But what we see is all the out of balance difficulty. We see the suffering. So if you see things without realizing the background of Buddha nature, if you see things without realizing perfect harmony, everything appears to be in the form of suffering. You only see that side of things. And these are the two truths. But if you understand the background of existence, impermanence, interdependence, you realize that suffering itself is just how we live and how we extend our life. Later in that chapter, he talks about how to control your mind since it does reel in response to these things. And he has a beautiful image, which is quite famous. People know about it. It says, to give your sheep and cow a large, spacious meadow is the way to control them. Not to try to pin them in other words. So it is with people. First, let them do what they want and watch them. This is the best policy. To ignore them is not so good. That's the worst policy. The second worst is trying to control them. The best one is to watch them, just to watch them without trying to control them. And the same with your mind. The same with all those parts, beings, things that you find inside. So posture is an expression of our true nature. Breathing is just a movement that arises and passes away within that spacious place, a beginner's mind. And we let go of control. We can begin to understand the nature between perfect harmony and the difficulties that we struggle with. At the end of that first section of the book, there's a talk called Nothing Special. This is another highlighted talk. Read the prologue, then read Nothing Special. This is your quick view. And he says something that I feel often. He starts the chapter by saying, I do not feel like speaking after Zazen. I feel the practice of Zazen is enough, but if I must say something, I think I would like to talk about how wonderful it is to practice Zazen. Our purpose is just to keep this practice forever. This practice started from beginningless time, and it will continue into an endless future. Strictly speaking, for a human being, there is no other practice than this practice. And I'll say he's not talking about Zen. He's talking about the essence of contemplative practice, which all human beings ultimately return to if we're either loved enough or are hurt enough. We'll move in that direction. He goes on, there is no other way of life than this way of life. Zen practice is the direct expression of our true nature. Of course, whatever we do is the expression of our true nature. But without this practice, it's very difficult to realize. It's our human nature to be active, and the nature of every existence. As long as we're alive, we're always doing something. But as long as you think, I'm doing this, or I have to do this, or I must attain something special, you're actually not doing anything. When you give up, when you no longer want something, or when you do not try to do anything special, then you do something. I'll stop for a moment. He said to his early students, who he was attempting to train with forms in the Zendo, said, you Americans always want to do your own thing. It's the 60s, remember? And he says, so I can't tell you apart. But when I ask you to do one thing, one form, then I can see you. Because he could see the way each person did that one thing. When you give up, when you no longer want something, or when you do not try to do anything special, then you do something. When there's no gaining idea in what you do, then you do something. In Zazen, what you're doing is not for the sake of anything. You may feel as if you're doing something special, but actually, it's only the expression of your true nature. It's the activity which appeases your inmost desire. It's the activity that appeases your inmost desire. He would ask his students, what is your inmost request? What is the deepest thing that you're called to in practice? And we sit in meditation, in whatever form you use, This activity appeases your inmost desire. But as long as you think you're practicing Zazen for the sake of something, there's no true practice. If you continue this simple practice every day, you will obtain a wonderful power. So he dangles something a little bit here. Before you attain it, it's something wonderful. But after you obtain it, it's nothing special. It is just you yourself. Nothing special. As a Chinese poem says, I went and I returned. It was nothing special. Rozan, famous for its misty mountains, Seiko for its water. Things this person saw, you know. People think it must be wonderful to see the famous range of mountains covered by mist and the water said to cover all the earth. But if you go there, you'll see that it's just water and mountains. Nothing special. It's kind of mystery that for people who have no experience of enlightenment, enlightenment is something wonderful. But if they attain it, it's nothing special. But yet, it is not nothing. And then he asked, do you understand? Knowing at that point, of course, you don't. For a mother with children, having children is nothing special. That's Zazen. So if you continue this practice more and more, you will acquire something. Nothing special, but nevertheless something. You may say universal nature or Buddha nature or enlightenment. You may call it by many names, but for the person who has it, it is nothing, and yet it is something. Some of you may have heard this from your teachers as well, but for me, almost every teacher I've studied with deeply has said, well, you know, as you make your way into more awakening, you're going to be very disappointed. This is not anything very special. It's mainly things falling away. But the space that's made when those things fall away is something special. Later, he says, intellectually, my talk makes no sense. But if you have experienced true practice, you'll understand what I mean. Buddha says, everything has Buddha nature. Buddha said, everything has Buddha nature. Dogen reads it this way, everything is Buddha nature. There's a difference. If you say everything has Buddha nature, it means Buddha nature is in each existence. So Buddha nature and each existence are different. But when you say everything is Buddha nature, it means everything is Buddha nature itself. Where there is no Buddha nature, there's nothing at all. Something apart from Buddha nature is just a delusion. So he goes on, but so to be a human being is to be a Buddha. Buddha nature is just another name for human nature, or true human nature. Thus, even though we do not do anything, you're actually doing something. You're expressing yourself. You're expressing your true nature. Your eyes will express, your voice will express, your demeanor will express. The most important thing is to express your true nature in the simplest, most adequate way and to appreciate it in its smallest existence. The most important thing is to express, you're not getting, to express your true nature in the simplest, most adequate way and to appreciate it in its smallest existence. He said in another place, doing one thing completely is awakening. While you are continuing this practice week after week, year after year, your experience will become deeper and deeper. And your experience will cover everything you do in your everyday life. The most important thing is to forget all gaining ideas, all dualistic ideas. In other words, just practice Zazen in a certain posture. Do not think about anything. Just remain on your cushion without expecting anything. Then eventually you will resume your own true nature. That is to say, your own true nature resumes itself. So this is another wonderful example where he's actually offering very advanced teachings about non-duality about the universal nature of mind, about its expression in the incarnate human being, and about how one practices with these two truths. And yet it's in a language that is down to earth and very inviting. There's a wonderful chapter on transiency, in which he says the basic teachings of Buddhism is the teaching of transiency or change. Well, this is what we're living in right now, that everything changes is the basic truth for each existence. David Chadwick, who is his biographer, starts Crooked Cucumber by a small vignette in which he says, one evening after a talk at Tassajara, I asked the question that is a silly question to ask, but I thought I would try. He said, Suzuki Roshi, can you summarize Buddhism in one word or a phrase? Thinking that he wouldn't answer. But he said that night he did. He said, everything changes. Next question. So this is the nature of transiency. And I would suggest that's another important chapter to take a look at, including also the one following called Believing in Nothing. It's a radical challenge about the way we make what we realize into beliefs. He says, I've discovered that it is necessary, absolutely necessary, to believe in nothing. Now, he's not talking about nihilism. That is, we have to believe in something which has no form and no color, something which exists before all forms and color appear. It's a very important point. No matter what God or doctrine you believe in, if you become attached to it, your belief will be based more or less on a self-centered idea. And he goes on about how once we form things, there's an old teaching story about Mara. You know, Mara is the sort of devil of Buddhism, the tempter, the one who throws you off the path. And in this teaching story, it said that Mara and his minions were watching a woman who was walking down the road, and they could tell that she had had an enlightenment experience. She'd waked up. She was an amazing being. And the minion for Mara said, uh-oh, this one woke up. What are we going to do? Mara said, oh, don't worry. She'll turn it into a belief. And this is what Suzuki Roshi is talking about. Given the nature of our time, let's go to the epilogue. There's a couple of things I want to say because they're so inspirational. I was going over some of these things earlier today with Aaron and talking about some of the things I wanted to emphasize. And I was reading this, and I hope I don't do what I did when I was reading to him, which is I began to weep. Suzuki Roshi says, here in America, he was speaking to Americans. There are more of you than just Americans, of course, listening probably. Here in America, we cannot define Zen Buddhist the way we do in Japan. American students are not priests and yet not completely laymen. I understand it this way, that you're not priests is an easy matter, but that you're not exactly laymen is more difficult. I think you're a special people and want some special practice that is not exactly priest practice and not exactly layman's practice. You're on your way to discovering some appropriate way of life. I think this is our Zen community, our group. This is what the ecumenical center is for. This is what Appamada is for. This is what we're about. Later, he speaks about big mind, about this space. He says, the big mind in which we must have confidence is not something which we can experience objectively. It's something which is always with you, always on your side. Your eyes are on your side. You cannot see your eyes. Your eyes can't see themselves. Eyes only see things outside, objective things. If you reflect on yourself, that self is not your true self anymore. You cannot project yourself on some objective thing to think about. The mind, which is always on your side, is not just your mind. It's universal mind, always the same, not different from another's mind. It's Zen mind. It's big, big mind. He speaks a bit about the rules that were developed in China. And later he says, I think we naturally need some way of life as a group and as Zen students in America. And as Hyakujo, who was one of the people who established monastic practice there, established our way of monastic life in China, I think we must establish an American way of Zen life. I'm not saying this jokingly. I'm pretty serious. But I do not want to be too serious. If we become too serious, we'll lose our way. If we are playing games, we'll lose our way. Little by little, with patience and endurance, we must find the way for ourselves. Find out how to live with ourselves and with each other. In this way, we'll find out our precepts. If we practice hard, concentrate on Zazen, and organize our life so that we can sit well, we'll find out what we're doing. But you have to be careful in the rules and the way you establish. If it's too strict, you'll fail. If it's too loose, the rules won't work. The only way to study pure mind is through practice. Our inmost nature wants some medium, some way to express itself, to realize itself. We answer this inmost request through our practice. Priest or layman is not the point, he says later. To find yourself as someone who's doing something is the point. To resume your actual being through practice. To resume the you which is always with everything, with Buddha, which is fully supported by everything right now. You may say it is impossible, but it is possible. Even in one moment, you can do it. At the very end, he says, I feel Americans, especially young Americans, have a great opportunity to find out the true way of life for human beings. You're quite free from material things. Once again, hippies, 60s. And you begin Zen practice with a very pure mind, a beginner's mind. You can understand Buddha's teachings exactly as he meant it. But we must not be too attached to America or Buddhism or even to our practice. We must have beginner's mind, free from possessing anything. A mind that knows everything is in flowing change. Nothing exists but momentarily in its present form and color. One thing flows into another and cannot be grasped. Before the rain stops, we hear a bird. Even under the heavy snow, we see snowdrops and some new growth. In the east, I saw rhubarb already. In Japan, in the spring, we eat cucumbers. The first time I met my teacher for Dokusan, for practice discussion at San Francisco Zen Center, I didn't know what to do. I had no idea. I was such a beginner. And she invited me up to the small tatami floored room. It was dark. San Francisco, so it was cold. With a small candle she lit, and she showed me where the incense was, and she asked me if I would light it. She showed me what to do. And we bowed and we sat down knee to knee, and we spent some time together. She said, when I first sat in this room with Suzuki Roshi, I could see in his face when he looked at me that all he saw was Buddha, and I couldn't understand that. How could he see that? But I could see in his face that's what he saw. And we had a conversation that was very gentle, and she was very gracious and kind. And over the years, I practiced more and took the precepts, went to Japan with her, which I would attempt to carry her luggage, and she would be mad at me, and she could do it herself. And we went out one night together in Kyoto when things were difficult within the Sangha. We were all tired. So we ate sushi and got drunk and staggered our way back. But after that first morning in that room in which Suzuki Roshi had sat, the next morning I walked down to Market Street in San Francisco and bought a beautiful calla lily, put it on her doorstep in the apartment where she lived, which is where Suzuki, Shunryu, and Mitsui used to live. with this haiku. Floorboards creak, clear breeze over the windowsill, Buddha Dharma flowers. And Cheryl, I think you might have some things to say.
I'm Cheryl Woodard. I'm the president of the Ecumenical Buddhist Society of Little Rock, your host this evening, ebslr.org. And I just want to say that, like everyone else, we're a center designed to facilitate people meeting in person and studying and practicing Buddhism. And so right now, of course, we're having to invent new ways. And Flint has really shown us a new way tonight. This was wonderful. I promise you two things. One is that next time we'll have a bigger room. More people can come besides the 100, because I know that some people were not able to get into this session tonight. And the
Who
second
knew there would
thing
be
is,
so many?
who knew? That's right. But the second thing is, I think I would like to, something that I've already done and that I think people might enjoy doing, is getting into smaller groups online and reading this book together and talking about it. Nobody has to be an expert. Nobody has to have the answers. You can just read it and talk about it and puzzle over it together. And so I would like to encourage you to do that. But the thing I want to ask you for tonight is to send us your email so that we can keep you informed of whatever else we think of in terms of getting together in this new way of communing with each other in this moment. And whatever might come, whatever Flint and us come together to think about going forward. So email donations@ebslr.org. That's just an email that reaches me. And so please email that if you would like to be kept apprised of what we're doing, but also to get a link to where the recording of tonight's session is going to land. And if you do want to make a donation to us or to Flint, we are going to be sharing everything together with him going forward. So to close, I would like to offer, my clock is chiming behind me, but I would like to offer this prayer, which was given to me by my teacher, and then we'll close. And this is the teacher has appeared in this world, and the teachings have illuminated it like the light of the sun. May the holders of the teachings be in harmony like siblings, and may the goodness of the teachings remain for a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. Look forward to more. Blessings to everyone. Be safe, be well.